Are you sitting comfortably? Well, I'll begin. This is called The Long Weekend by Troon Harrison and Michael Foreman. Can you see who's going to the beach? Okay, maybe I'll read it like this and then show you the pictures. It was summer and James was having a birthday. He was going to be 5 years old, which is easy to remember because it's all the fingers on one hand. James, said his mother, what would you like for your birthday? Would you like to have a picnic with your friends and eat hot dogs? Or would you like a trip to the zoo to ride on a camel? Or would you like to go to the beach for a long weekend? She said that a long weekend was 3 days all in a row, and each one of them was a holiday. There's Mum talking to James. James went away and thought. He thought lying down in the tall grass and white daisies. He thought sitting in the cool green shade underneath the picnic table. And he thought lying on the hot boards of his treehouse. He thought about hot dogs and mustard and ants. And then he thought about camels and their big flat feet. Last of all, he thought about a long weekend, which would be 3 whole days at the beach. Then James went back to his mother and whispered in her ear. He had a loud, tickly kind of whisper, and he said, Mummy, for my birthday, I want a long weekend. On the first day of the long weekend, James and his mother walked. Sorry, it's a bit hard for me to see. James and his mother walked down to the beach early in the morning. The sand was smooth and clean, and when James took off his shoes, his feet could feel how cool it was. Mummy said that the tide had come in the night and washed the beach. It's a beautiful looking beach, isn't it? It's a bit like where you go to the beach. James had brought his toy cars to the beach. He sat down and began to build in the sand. First he built 2 long, thin hills, and in the valley between he built a town. He put his fire engine in the fire station and made a garage where it was repaired. He built roads over the hills and made a tunnel through them for the lorries. His breakdown lorry cruised the busy roads looking for cars to tow. His fire engine dashed out of the station with its red paint shining in the sun. Mummy said she could hear the siren wailing. When James and his mother went home, their shadows were long and jumpy in the sand. Little waves were rising higher up the beach as the tide came in. As darkness fell, they washed away the town in the valley and flooded the tunnels in the hills. They washed the beach clean. On the second morning of the long weekend, James and his mother came down to the beach to find little birds calling along the water's edge. Can you see all the little birds? James began to build again. He built 5 round hills with valleys in between. He planted some trees. He dammed one of the valleys and filled it with water to make a pond where ducks could swim. He had brought his farm animals and he put them to graze on the hills. He fenced them in with a wall of pebbles. In the valley, James built a farmhouse and planted a garden and an orchard where children played. James imagined hanging upside down by his feet. Then he built a road for the tractor to roll along around the hills and across the top of the dam, carrying hay to the barn. The hay was full of dried flowers and prickles, and it smelled of summer. Early in the morning, the cock crowed at James's farm. "Oh, oh, oh!" Mummy said she could hear it. There's all the things James built. When James and his mother went home, their shadows were long and wobbly. The waves came up the tractor road to the farmhouse. They flooded the pond and licked at the 5 round hills. So that's day 2 of the 3-day long weekend. On the 3rd day of the long weekend, James and his mother had the whole beach to themselves. James sat down and started to build in the sand. First, he built a great steep hill, and then he put a castle on the top of it. He built towers and walls with pebbles for doors and seashells for windows. Look at that giant castle. He made flags and stood them along the battlements. Then he built a moat around the bottom of the hill, and he filled it with water from the edge of the waves and set a wooden drawbridge across it. Next, he planted a deep green forest over the hills for the deer and the rabbits to share, with one unicorn. Through the forest, he built a road for the knights to ride along in their shining armour. James imagined riding with them on a black horse with a golden flag fluttering in the wind. Then James noticed the little waves were creeping over the sand. They inched towards his moat. James took his spade and dug a harbour just where the waves were emptying into the moat. A fleet of pirate ships came in with the wind and the tide and tacked with billowing sails beneath the ancient castle wall. As the ships drew near, trumpets sounded from the castle walls. I think the pirate ships are down here. And there's Mama sitting up on top of the sand reading a book. Then the drawbridge was lowered and the crowd surged forward. A boy stepped out of the crowd and boarded the biggest pirate ship. As the trumpets sounded their fanfare, doo-doo-doo-doo, the pirates cheered and the fleet set sail. James asked Mama if she could hear the sound of the trumpets as they slowly died away. She said she could. When James and his mother went home, their shadows were long and fluttering on the beach. The long weekend was over, and so was the best of summer. The tide was rising and large waves crashed over the harbour and against the castle walls. The flags and battlements went swirling into the water. Oops. James was 5 years old. In his pocket he had 2 shells, a pebble and a piece of seaweed. He told his mother that he was going to keep them very carefully, perhaps for 100 years, perhaps forever. That way he would always remember the long weekend. And that's the end of the story. I think if your mama and dada had been at the beach, they would have been playing with you instead of leaving you to play.